soothing story time. The talking trees of Trebbly and the snowmen. The creatures of nature had gathered to tell stories. Beam went first. The talking trees of Trebbly were a little bit bored. Winter was the least exciting time of the year. Half of the trees' leaves fell off, and they stood in the forest completely naked. Not that they minded, they were asleep. Only the trees with leaves were awake and bored. They still talked, though, incessantly, as they always did. Reminiscences at the moment. They had talked about the birds hopping about for a solid month, and not one out of the ordinary thing had happened to the birds, or was done by the birds. In fact, they were a little annoyed at the birds for not being more interesting. They told the birds this. The birds had told them to mind their own business for once. But unfortunately, the talking trees of Trebbly never minded their own business, because they were rooted to the spot and couldn't do anything interesting for themselves. They lived through others, whether the others wanted to be lived through or not. Not everyone wants trees talking about them behind their backs. The forest where the talking trees of Trebbly lived was not close to people. It was a fair walk away and didn't have that many visitors. Children rarely came into this part of the forest in winter. It was a long way from their homes, and it was cold. They preferred somewhere closer, where they could get a warm drink when the gloves became soggy, their hands became cold, and their noses were red and dribbled. But today there were adventurous children. They scoffed at the cold, wouldn't dream of playing indoors when there was snow outside, and they wouldn't be caught dead playing in their back gardens when there was a whole snowy wilderness to run in, round and through, all of it untouched by any other person. They were not at all bored. Today the children had packed a lunch and come out to play in the forest of Trebbly. Of course, the talking trees of Trebbly knew that this was a bad thing. To them, it looked like a murderous horde of children were charging towards them. Some sort of doom was coming upon them. Such a thing had not happened before. Children in the spring, yes. The summer, yes. Running round the autumn leaves, which they found a bit odd and unnatural, but never in winter, and never when the world went white. They didn't remember seeing children. But the trees on the edge of the forest saw them coming. Little people in knitted hats. Before they were with big people, they did remember them, but not on their own. Now they were laughing, throwing snowballs at each other, falling over and getting back up again. They made the snow untidy, but the trees didn't understand that when the children threw snowballs, they were not angry. The trees thought the children were so filled with rage that they were attacking each other as they raced towards the trees to wreak their havoc upon them, emitting strange squealing cries of fury without the big people to stop them. Well, the group of trees on the edge watched. The tree whose turn it was to pass on the news to the next group of trees in the forest passed the news along. It spread out through the forest. Rage-filled children were coming. A great doom must be coming. This had never happened before. Some of the younger trees tried to wake up the huge oaks that slept through the winter, to ask them if this had happened before, and if so, what doom had come. But they couldn't wake them. The oaks would wake for the spring and nothing else. So the remaining trees concluded that this must never have happened before, or they would have stories of the terrible things the small people did, if any tree had survived it. They watched the children approach, the muffled crunch of boots on snow, the long drawn-out trail behind them in the white landscape, the giggling. The trees talked. They came up with all sorts of terrible things that the children might do, turn into giant tree-eating monsters, turn into massive balls of fire and burn the forest down, stop the spring from ever coming, make the clouds fall on them, make it forever night. The talking trees of Trebbly shook with fear. The children bounded along through the last of the open field and arrived at the edge of the forest. A very nervous and excitable little tree on the edge let out a high scream, but luckily people cannot hear the trees talking. The rest of the trees did though, and all believed the carnage had started. Panic ensued, wild talk, leaves rustling, animals rolling their eyes as the trees were being dramatic again, a light snoring from a few of the trees that were still asleep. The children bounded into the forest, running round the trunk as the trees screamed in horror. They would have jumped 10 meters in the air if they could have. But the children played on happily. Each tree they passed screamed until they found a clearing and decided to build snowmen. The trees round the clearing screamed for a bit, but stopped after a while as nothing horrible had actually happened to them. They waited a bit to see if the worst would happen, but it wasn't happening. Eventually, they had to pass the message on that they were not hurt. As the children played, the trees asked each other again and again how many had been hurt or killed, what had happened, but they couldn't find anyone who was hurt, only talk that there was a hurt tree somewhere. Meanwhile, the trees round the clearing were watching the children very intently. They were doing something with the snow. What could they be doing? Snow couldn't hurt the trees. The children were rolling round balls of snow. Why? They were going to knock down the trees with the balls of snow. But the children didn't. They put the snowballs in the middle of the clearing. They then made some more. Oh no, they must be making a huge pile of the snowballs so they could bowl the trees over all at once. But the children put the snowballs on top of each other, making them all the same. The talking trees of Trebbly passed this information back and forth amongst each other, till one tree had the bright idea the children were making snow monsters that killed trees. So while the children were happily constructing the snowmen, they couldn't know it because they couldn't speak tree. But there was a cacophony of screams from the panicking trees around them. The children loved the way it was so peaceful out here and free of boring adults. Some of the creatures of Trebbly Forest stopped being annoyed at the trees, for they did speak tree, and began to believe that the trees really were in danger. It was difficult to understand quite what the trees were screaming about. Monsters, apparently. Some of the creatures fled. Some decided to see what the trees were screaming about. The birds flew into the trees near the clearing and watched the children for a while. As each child constructed a snowman, they became more and more hungry. They all found a patch of trampled down snow and sat themselves down to have lunch together, watched intently by the trees. There was now a clearing full of snowmen. Some had coal for eyes and a carrot for a nose. Some had a stone for one eye and a leaf for another. These were the pirate snowmen. They had fallen twigs for arms. Some had more than 2 arms. One excited child had made an 8-armed snowman with 2 heads and 5 mouths, which the trees found particularly terrifying. The birds were interested now. The children were eating sandwiches. There would be crumbs. One child was a very messy eater. The birds hopped along little branches till they were closest to that child. Various other forest creatures that had not run away came to see the children. The children noticed nothing. They finished their lunch and got up. The children had all decided to make a huge snow fort with battlements and a room in the middle to store the snowballs. The children began to run through the trees and bring back more snow. Cries of "Ah, the children!" echoed in tree language around the forest. The children pushed the snow through the trees to the clearing. Some worked at the central room, like a square igloo. Some worked on the battlements. Some made really well-packed snowballs to store in the middle. The trees watched with only the occasional tree scream echoing around the frozen landscape. What were the children doing now? It was a structure. What evilness could be inside? Or is it a home for the tree-killing monsters to live in? That would mean they would stay and devour every tree in the forest. The children were still working on the fort when the light began to fail, and they all rushed off home so they wouldn't be told off for staying out in the dark. The trees watched the children go, and then turned their attention to the horrid snow creatures now standing in the clearing. One of the trees managed to convince some squirrels to attack one of the snow creatures to drive it away. The squirrels launched themselves out of the trees at the strange creatures. A bit of snow came off when they hit. That was all, but one lucky squirrel got away with a carrot nose. The birds were not interested. They'd eaten the crumbs, and it was time for them to roost for the night. Night fell. The trees braced themselves for the attack, but nothing happened. They waited for the whole night, and nothing happened. In the morning the children came back, had a row, kicked each other's snowmen over, then had an acrimonious snowball fight, then left. The sun came out. One of the snowmen dripped. The closest tree let out a short scream. Then there was a pause. After a while, another drip, followed by a short scream. This went on for some time. You should have heard the commotion when a twiggy arm fell off. Some badgers came along. They had heard the commotion and wondered if there were any bits of food left lying around. Unfortunately for them, the birds had got to it first. But the badgers liked the ford. It kept the wind out. They dug around and found a sweet one of the children had dropped, and the smallest badger ate it. The badgers tried to explain to the trees that the snowmen were not monsters and were not going to eat them. They had no smell of their own. They were not alive. All of the creatures tried to convince the trees that there were not monsters waiting to eat them. The squirrels went and sat on the snowmen to show the trees how they did not attack, and stole another frozen carrot nose. One squirrel gnawed the coal in the hope that it might be edible, but the trees would not listen. They still watched with terror. Well, over time, the snowmen just melted. Every drip watched by the trees and passed round the forest. The fort melted and fell in on itself. The rest of the snow in the forest melted, and there were only a few sad piles of compacted snow dotted around the clearing. In the end, the ground was bare, and the trees told the tale again and again, especially over the years to the new saplings, what an escape they had had from a terrible doom brought about by the children who had made the snow monsters who killed trees. The animals that heard them tell the tale rolled their eyes and went about their business. The end.